Grace Holloway had 3 hours left, and the only thing she owned worth anything was standing in the paddock with his nose pressed against the fence rail, waiting for her the way he always did. She had counted the hours from the moment Silas Prout stepped off her porch that morning, his boots leaving neat prints in the frost, his voice flat and unhurried, the voice of a man who has said the same words to enough desperate people that they no longer cost him anything. $12, he told her. $12 by sundown, or he would ride to the county office first thing tomorrow and file the papers himself. Once that happened, he said, there would be nothing left to discuss. She had $4.10. She knew the number the way she knew her own name, because she had counted it 3 times on the kitchen table that morning with her hands not quite steady, the coins laid out in small stacks like something that might multiply if she looked at it long enough. It did not multiply. She had sold the last of her canned peaches to the Reamer family on Tuesday. She had finished 2 shirts by lamplight on Wednesday, her eyes aching by the time she tied off the last button. None of it added up to $12, and there was no more cloth to sew, and no more jars in the cellar, and no more mornings before sundown. She stood at the paddock fence a long while after Prout's horse had disappeared down the road, looking at the house her father had built plank by plank over 20 years, the barn he had raised with 3 neighbors and a keg of cider, the chicken coop leaning slightly to the east the way it had leaned since the blizzard 2 winters back. 40 acres. Not the richest land in the territory, but honest land that gave back what a person put into it. It had been enough for a man and his daughter. It was not enough for a woman alone with a debt she had not chosen and could not outrun. Solomon lifted his head when she came near, a white horse with a gray mist along his shoulders, and pushed his nose into her collarbone the way he had done since he was a colt and her father had led him up the drive on a rope, saying, "This one's for you, Grace. He'll look after you when I can't." Her father had been gone 14 months. Solomon had been keeping that promise every day since. She thought of her father often in the ledger book, because he had taught her to keep the farm accounts before he ever let her hold a saddle. Land is lost more often to bad arithmetic than bad weather, he used to say, tapping the page with one thick finger. She had run the arithmetic 3 times that morning, and it came out the same each time. She needed $8 she did not have. She had one thing worth far more than $8, and only one person she trusted to take it fairly. In the last weeks of his life, when he had grown too weak to walk the fence line but not too weak to plan for the daughter he was leaving behind, her father had said it to her plainly without repeating himself, the way he said the things that mattered most. If it ever comes to it, take Solomon to Wyatt Sutton. He knows horses better than any man in this territory, and he's fair. He'll treat the animal right. She had carried the sentence for 14 months without needing it. She needed it now. She went inside for her coat. Her hands were trembling when she buttoned it, and she made herself stop and press them flat against her sides until they were still, because a woman who meant to ask for a fair price could not walk into a man's yard shaking like a leaf caught in the wind. The Sutton Ranch lay a little more than 20 minutes north by horseback, and the ride there crossed more distance than the miles alone accounted for. 600 acres of the best grazing land in the valley. A house built solid and larger than one man needed. A barn that was the pride of the county, and cattle scattered across the south pasture like a slow-moving river of brown and white. Wyatt Sutton had inherited the operation at 26, 5 years back, and had run it the only way he knew, by outworking every man on his payroll and asking honest questions of anyone who knew more than he did about a given thing. He had known James Holloway the way good neighbors know each other, a shared fence line, a nod at the Larkspur market, the occasional hour spent leaning on a gate discussing weather and cattle prices. He had watched Grace's lamp burn late from the ridge above his own north pasture more nights than he would have admitted to anyone, and he had not once ridden down to ask why, because interfering with a proud woman managing her own land was the surest way he knew to end a friendship for good. He had told himself this every time he saw that lamp, and he had believed it mostly. Grace rode Solomon through the Sut gate a little after 2 in the afternoon. Wyatt was in the corral working a young bay gelding, patient, unhurried work, the kind that asked a horse to understand rather than obey. He saw her at the gate and read something in the straight line of her back, the way a person sits when they are holding themselves together by will alone, and he handed the lead rope to his hired man, Amos, without a word and walked over. Amos watched him go with the particular stillness of a man filing something away to think about later. Wyatt took off his hat at the fence. "Grace," he said. "Wyatt," she said. She had rehearsed 3 different ways to say what came next. None of them started the way it actually came out of her. "I need to sell you Solomon," she said. He looked at the horse. He looked at her. He said nothing, and the silence gave her room to keep going rather than crowding her into silence of her own. "Prude is calling the debt today before sundown," she said. "I'm $8 short, and there's nothing left in the house worth selling. My father told me if it ever came to this, to bring him to you." She held Wyatt's gaze even though it cost her something to do it. "He said you'd treat him right." Wyatt looked at the horse for a long moment, taking him in the way he took in any animal he was about to make a decision about, the set of the legs, the clarity in the eye. The way Solomon stood close to Grace's shoulder, as though he had already decided where he belonged. "How much do you need?" he said. $8, she said. "That clears it and carries me through the month. I know what he's worth. I know $8 isn't it, but it's what I need and it's what I'm asking for." Wyatt looked at this woman standing at his gate on a cold afternoon with her chin held level and her hands finally still, and he thought of 14 months of a lamp burning late on the far ridge, and of James Holloway telling him once, not as a compliment exactly, but as a plain fact, that his daughter had more grit than any man he'd hired in 30 years. He set his hat back on his head. "Come inside," he said. "There's something else we ought to talk about before we talk about a sale." She followed him inside because there was no better option in front of her, and because something in his voice had shifted from negotiation to something steadier. He held the door. She sat at the kitchen table, and only then did she notice how tired her legs were from the ride. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with the 20 minutes in the saddle, and everything to do with 14 months of holding a farm together with 2 hands and no help. Wyatt set coffee to boil, and she looked around the kitchen while she waited, the pantry visible through the open door beside the stove. Bulk supplies stacked without order. Flour set beside a tin of kerosene, which was a fire risk and also simply careless. She filed the thought away and looked back at the table. "You're $8 short after today," Wyatt said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "And the payment after that, and the one after that, until the debt's clear." "I've been managing it," she said, a little sharper than she meant to. "I know you have," he said, and something in the way he said it told her he meant it plainly, not as a soft word to smooth over what came next. "I'm not offering charity, Grace. I want to be clear about that before I say anything else." She held still. "I wasn't going to accept it if you were." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm not offering it." He set 2 cups of coffee on the table and sat across from her. "My housekeeper left for her sister's place in August. Since then, I've had 5 hired men eating whatever gets put in front of them, and a set of house accounts that haven't been touched since June." He looked toward the pantry, the same disorder she had already catalogued. "I need someone who can run the household, keep the books straight, manage the provisions. It pays $2.50 a week. You'd keep your own place. Ride over daily, or stay here when the work calls for it." She studied him. "That's a fair wage for that work." "It's what the work is worth," he said. "If you take it, I advance you $8 against your first wages today. You settle with Prude this afternoon. You keep Solomon, and he runs in my paddock, which has better grass and a sounder roof than yours does right now." He held her gaze without blinking. "That's not a kindness. That's an arrangement that suits us both." She looked past him at the pantry again, at the kerosene beside the flour, at a kitchen that had clearly been surviving rather than running. She thought of her father, of the sentence he'd given her like a key to a door he knew she'd need opened someday. Take Solomon to Wyatt Sutton. He'll treat the animal right. She had thought for 14 months that he only meant the horse. "Why didn't you offer this before?" she asked. "You've known how things were." Wyatt turned his cup a quarter turn on the table, the way a man does when he's deciding how honest to be. "Because you never asked," he said. "And because your father told me once you had more pride than good sense and meant it as the finest thing he could say about you." He met her eyes. "I respected that. Maybe I respected it a season or 2 longer than I should have." She sat with that a moment, $4.10 in her pocket, and less than 2 hours left before sundown. "All right," she said, "I'll take the position." He stood before she'd finished the sentence, already reaching for the tin box where he kept the ranch's cash. "I'll get the $8. She rode into Larkspur with the coin purse heavy in her coat and found Silas Pruitt at his desk with the particular patience of a man expecting to be disappointed. She counted the money onto the desk in front of him, and he took it with an expression that suggested he had, in fact, expected a different afternoon entirely. She didn't explain where the money had come from, and he didn't ask. Outside, she stood beside Solomon in the last gray light of the afternoon and pressed her forehead against his neck for a long moment before she climbed back into the saddle. Then she rode home, made a small supper she barely tasted, and went to bed early, too tired even to feel the relief she'd been chasing all day. She started at the Sutton Ranch on Wednesday. The house accounts were not the work of a careless man so much as a busy one who understood cattle prices down to the penny and had no idea what a kitchen needed to run. She spent her first day taking inventory of every shelf and barrel in the pantry. She spent the second building a system that made sense, moving the flour away from the kerosene, grouping the dry goods by how quickly they turned, labeling what needed labeling in her own careful hand. On Friday, Amos wandered into the kitchen mid-afternoon and stopped dead in the doorway. "The sugar was where a man could find it," he said, looking at the shelf where it no longer sat. "I know where it is now, too," Grace said, not looking up from the ledger spread across the table. "It's been in the same spot 4 years. It was also sitting beside a fire hazard for 4 years," she said. Amos looked at the new arrangement, looked at her, looked back at the shelf as though it might rearrange itself out of respect for tradition. "Robert," he stopped and corrected himself. "Wyatt know you're moving his kitchen around." "He hired me to run the house," she said. "The pantry's part of the house." Amos leaned against the doorframe for a long moment, the look of a man filing away something he intended to bring up again later, possibly at length, possibly in front of witnesses. "You've been here 3 days," he said finally. "The pantry needed attention on day 1, Grace said. I was being patient." He went out to find Wyatt at the fence line and told him, without any preamble at all, that the new housekeeper had moved the sugar. Wyatt asked if that was a problem. Amos considered it seriously before admitting that it was not, and went back to mending wire. That evening, Wyatt came in for supper and couldn't find the flour where it had always sat, and stood in the kitchen doorway working out what to say about it, and then didn't say anything at all, because the kitchen smelled like fresh bread for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, and a man who has eaten his own poor cooking for 5 years knows better than to argue with an improvement. It was the following Friday that she told him about the overpayments. She'd found them going back through the supplier ledgers, 3 separate accounts, 6 months of records, and a difference that came to $11.40 paid out for goods never fully delivered. She laid the figures in front of him at the kitchen table and watched him go still the way she'd seen him go still in the corral, working something through and determined to get it right. "You found this in 3 days," he said. "There was room for improvement in the filing." "How much room?" "Considerable," she said. He looked at the numbers a long time. "My father taught me to keep farm books before he taught me to sit a horse," she said. "He used to say land is lost more often to bad arithmetic than bad weather." Wyatt was quiet a moment. "He said something to me about you once," he said. "About a month before he passed." He stopped. "Something about you keeping better books than he ever had and that the place would outlast him because of it." She looked down at the ledger, at the careful columns she'd built out of a stranger's disorder, and felt something in her chest she didn't have a name for yet. "I thought he meant it as comfort," Wyatt said. "I'm starting to think he meant it as instruction." She didn't answer that. She turned back to the figures because the figures were safer ground, and told him she'd already written to the suppliers and expected corrections within the month. He said the wage wasn't enough for what she was doing. She told him not to change the terms, not yet, and he agreed, though something passed behind his eyes that told her the conversation wasn't finished. It had only been set down for later. Before winter closed the roads, before anything else could be said, December arrived in the valley the way it always did in that country, without asking permission or giving warning. If a story like this one is keeping you company today, stay a while longer. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, because I read every one, and this story is only getting started. December came down over the valley the way it always did, without negotiation. The lower fence rails vanished under drift after drift, and the 20-minute ride between the two properties stretched into the better part of an hour, Solomon picking his way through snow with the patience of an animal who had done harder things and didn't think much of complaining about it. On the third morning of it, Wyatt said, without much ceremony, that the east bedroom had sat empty since his mother passed, and it made no sense at all for Grace to be riding an hour each way in the dark when the work she was doing was right there under his roof. She moved her things in that same week and told herself it was only practical, the kind of arrangement two sensible people made when the weather demanded it. She told herself that most mornings, sitting alone at the kitchen table before the house woke, watching the dark turn gray and then that particular hard blue that belonged only to a Montana winter morning, listening for the third floorboard in the hallway that creaked when Wyatt was up. She knew by then that he took his coffee black. She knew he read at that same table for 20 minutes most mornings before he went out to the stock, and that on the mornings something was weighing on him, he read the same page twice without seeming to notice he'd done it. There had been more of those mornings in December than there had been in November. One evening she found him in the barn after supper, working a strip of harness leather by lantern light, and beside his elbow on the workbench sat a tool she recognized before she recognized anything else in the room. A handle worn smooth and mended twice at the seam, the kind of tool a man keeps because it still works better than anything new. She knew the small mark burned into the base of the handle, the way she knew her own hand. "That was my father's," she said. Wyatt looked at it like he'd forgotten it was sitting there. "He lent it to me 4 winters back," he said. "I kept meaning to return it. He turned it over once. After he passed, he stopped and looked at the lantern instead of at her. I kept it because it was the last thing he ever handed me. I should have brought it to you a long while ago. I didn't know how to do it without it feeling like more than it was." She stood in the barn doorway with the cold coming in behind her and looked at the tool a long moment, thinking of a man who had trusted Wyatt Sutton with something small enough to lend and important enough to want back, and thinking of a sentence she'd carried 14 months. Take him to Wyatt Sutton. He'll treat the animal right. She crossed the barn floor and picked the tool up and turned it over once in her own hands before she set it back down in front of him. "Keep it," she said. "He'd rather it stayed where it gets used." Wyatt looked at the tool, then at her. "He talked about you," he said. "Often. Every time I saw him, it was you he wanted to talk about." She didn't trust herself to answer that. She said good night and went back inside, and didn't examine too closely the warmth that had settled somewhere in her chest sometime between November and December, the particular feeling of a place that had started, without her quite agreeing to it, to feel like hers. On the first Monday of January, she rode into Larkspur to make her monthly payment against the Prute debt, $2 exactly, folded into an envelope she'd sealed the night before. She set it on the counter. The clerk looked at it, then at his ledger, then at her with the expression of a man whose paper didn't match what was standing in front of him. "Miss Holloway," he said, "that account's already settled." She stared at him. "Settled how?" "In full," he said, and turned the ledger to show her. "January 15th. Payment of $8 against the full remaining balance." He tapped the entry. "It's closed." She looked at the date. She'd been at the Sutton kitchen on the 15th, elbow-deep in the winter provision count, and had not once left the house that day. She looked at the name entered beside the payment. "Wyatt Sutton." She folded her $2 back into her pocket, thanked the clerk in a voice that came out steadier than she felt, and walked out onto the boardwalk into a cold that seemed suddenly beside the point. She stood there a moment thinking of a kitchen table and the words that arrangement suits us both, and a wage of $2.50 that he'd wanted to raise, and she'd told him not to touch. She thought of $11.40 in corrected overpayments, and a leather-handled tool set back on a workbench, and a debt, her debt, quietly closed out from under her without a single word said. She got on Solomon and rode back to the ranch with her jaw set the entire way. He was at the south fence when she rode in, and he read whatever was on her face before she'd even swung down from the saddle. "You went by the lending office," he said. "I did," she said. He was quiet a moment, looking at the fence rail instead of at her. "It was $8, he said. "That isn't the point," she said. I know it isn't the point, he said, and that surprised her more than an argument would have. I should have told you before I did it. I didn't because I knew you'd have refused it if I asked first. He paused. I was right about that. Being right about it doesn't make it right, she said. No, he said, it doesn't. He looked out at the mountains a long moment, then back at her, and when he spoke again, there was none of the careful distance he usually kept in his voice. Helping you didn't give me any right to decide things for you, he said. The $8 can stand as a debt between us, if that's what you want. You can work it off in wages, or I can ask the lending office to reverse the entry, and we find another way to settle it. Those are real choices, Grace. I mean that. She stood very still, Solomon shifting his weight behind her, breath clouding in the cold. That, she said finally, is the first thing you've said today that sounds like respect. He held her gaze without flinching from it. I know, he said. I'm better at solving a problem than I am at explaining myself. I'm working on that second part. It doesn't come naturally to me. Why not, she asked. Because when I care about something, he said, I tend to act on it instead of talk about it. It's a fault. I know it's a fault. She almost smiled despite herself, standing there in the cold with her breath fogging between them. I paid it, he went on, because I couldn't stand watching you carry it. Not because you couldn't manage it yourself. You've managed better than I managed my own house for 5 years running. Only because I didn't want you to have to. He looked down at his hands a moment. That's the honest reason. I should have said it to your face, instead of just walking into town and doing it. She stood at that fence a long while, looking at a man who'd quietly paid off her debt and said nothing for 3 weeks, who had just handed her 3 real choices and admitted a fault without dressing it up as anything else. She thought about the East bedroom, about second readings of the same page, about a tool set back on a workbench, and a lamp that used to burn late on a ridge he'd been watching longer than he'd ever let on. Give me until Sunday, she said, not to decide whether I care for you. I already know that answer. She held his eyes to decide whether I can trust you with knowing it. He nodded, no argument in him at all. Sunday, he said. She rode home through the cold with her chest tight and her mind full, and behind her at the fence, Amos, who had been mending wire close enough to hear most of it, waited until she was well down the road before he ambled over. April, he said to Wyatt. Wyatt looked at him. What? I'm betting on April, Amos said, for the proposal, and he went back to his wire without another word, leaving Wyatt standing at the fence with the particular expression of a man who suspects everyone around him has already worked out something he's only just beginning to understand about himself. She came back Sunday, not with an answer she'd had to search for, but with the one she'd already known and spent 3 days deciding she was ready to trust. What happens next between them, and what the whole valley, including a hired man with a silver dollar writing on it. Sunday came in soft and cold, the kind of light that made the snow on the lower pastures look almost blue. Wyatt was on the porch when she rode up, which told her plainly enough that he'd been watching the road since morning, though neither of them said so. She tied Solomon at the post and climbed the steps and sat beside him on the top one, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, just looked out at the valley together, at the mountains holding their last snow, at Solomon standing loose-hipped and unbothered at the rail as though he already knew how this particular Sunday was going to end. The $8, she said finally, I'll pay it back through wages, $2 a month until it's settled between us. All right, he said. And you'll ask me first next time, she said, before you decide something on my behalf, even a kind thing, especially a kind thing. Yes, he said, I will. She looked over at him then, really looked, the way she hadn't quite let herself in the weeks since December. My father knew something about you, she said. He trusted you with his tool and with Solomon and with the one instruction he left me that mattered most. I've spent a long while trying to work out what he understood that I didn't. She paused. I think I understand it now. Wyatt met her eyes steadily, the way he always did without performance in it. What did he know, he asked. That you solve a problem before you ever get around to explaining it, she said, and that you're working on the explaining part. She held his gaze a moment longer. He also knew I had more pride than sense, which means I need someone honest with me even when I'd rather not hear it. You were honest with me on Friday. That mattered more than the $8 ever did. Wyatt looked out at Solomon, then back at her. Grace, he said. Yes. I'd like to court you, he said, properly. I know, she said, I'll let you. He caught the small smile she hadn't quite managed to hide, and something in his shoulders eased that she hadn't noticed was tight until it wasn't anymore. But Wyatt, she said. Yes. Next time you want to do something for me, ask me first. Yes, he said again, I will. They sat there a long while as the cold came down off the mountains, Solomon lifting his head once to study them both before deciding there was nothing worth interrupting and going back to the frozen grass at his feet, because he had known since November how this was going to end, even if it had taken the two of them considerably longer to catch up. March arrived the way it does in that country all at once, like something that has simply grown tired of waiting. The snow pulled back from the fence lines. The creek ran loud and full. Solomon tore through the new green grass with the enthusiasm of an animal who had been holding his breath since October. Wyatt courted her the way he did most things, plainly and without much ceremony, which suited her better than anything showier would have. He brought her a fistful of early wildflowers one afternoon with the slight awkwardness of a man who understood the gesture was correct, but wasn't entirely sure he'd managed it right, and she set them in a jar above the kitchen sink without saying anything about it, which he seemed to understand as answer enough. On Easter Sunday, he tried twice to tell her that the blue dress she wore suited her, and got tangled both times until it came out as the dress suits you. Only the color, really, which was not an improvement on the first attempt, but was at least entirely honest. Amos, standing near the barn door within easy earshot, found urgent business in the opposite direction. Wyatt didn't seem to notice, or didn't care, which by then amounted to the same thing. If a story like this one has you thinking about someone in your own life who showed up quietly instead of loudly, tell me about them in the comments below. I read every one, and this is where the story turns toward its ending. It was an evening in April when Wyatt came in from the south pasture with the look of a man who had made up his mind and didn't intend to spend another day sitting on it. Grace was at the stove when he sat down at the kitchen table and looked at his hands for a moment before he looked at her instead. I used to think this house was quiet because that's how I liked it, he said. I know now it was only waiting on someone whose absence I'd start to notice. She set the spoon down. She turned around. He was watching her with the same direct, unhurried eyes he'd had since the day she rode through his gate with a horse she meant to sell. Grace Holloway, he said, will you marry me? It wasn't really a question, not the way he said it. It was the last honest thing left to say. She crossed the kitchen and sat across from him and put her hands flat on the table, and he covered them with his own. Yes, she said simply, the way she said the things that mattered most. They married in June, in the little church at Larkspur, with the valley outside gone entirely green from the snowmelt, and the whole town turned out to see it. Amos sat in the front row, had been there since sunrise by all accounts, the seat of a man with a personal stake in the proceedings and no intention of missing a moment. Grace wore a dress she'd sewn herself, plain cream linen, practical enough to wear again, because she had never in her life made a thing meant to be used only once. Wyatt wore his one good shirt with the faint discomfort of a man far more at home in work clothes, willing all the same to suffer through an important occasion. Before the ceremony in the small back room where she waited, Wyatt knocked and came in holding something wrapped in a strip of cloth. Inside it was her father's tool, cleaned and oiled until the old handle gleamed. It ought to go back to your side of the fence line, he said. It was his. She held it a moment, turning it over, the worn mark on the handle catching the light. She thought of a man who had trusted this one with something small enough to lend and important enough to want returned, and who had also trusted him with something far larger without ever saying so outright. Keep it, she said, and handed it back. Between the two places, it'll see more use than it would sitting in a drawer. He held it without another word, because there wasn't one that needed adding. Outside after the vows, Amos found Wyatt in the churchyard crowd and held out his hand, palm up. April 22nd, he said. I had the closest guess. Wyatt looked at the outstretched hand. You bet April, he said. Before May counts as April, Amos said, entirely unbothered. Wyatt reached into his coat and dropped a silver dollar into his palm, and Amos closed his fist around it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had known something everyone else was still catching up to. You should have bet February, Wyatt told him. I knew February, Amos said. I just wasn't sure you did yet. And he walked off toward the tables the town had set up under the cottonwoods, well pleased with himself. Grace kept the 40 acres. It wasn't a question either of them raised twice. Her father's land, her own 14 months of holding it together alone, and she wasn't about to let it go simply because she'd married a man with 600 acres beside it. The two properties ran together the way good neighboring land does, and Solomon took full advantage of having the run of both, once making off with Amos's hat from a fence post, and being discovered later in the south pasture showing no remorse whatsoever. On an evening the following spring, sitting on the porch with the light going gold over the valley, Grace watched Solomon graze in the near pasture and thought back to a Monday in November. 3 hours on the clock and $4.10 in her pocket, and a white horse she'd ridden north to the one man her father trusted. Her father had never told her that Wyatt Sutton would give her a home. He'd never told her that Wyatt Sutton was the man she'd marry. He had only ever said, he'll treat the animal right. He had, the horse, the accounts, and in time, her, honestly, patiently, and with the understanding that a woman who had held 40 acres together alone for 14 months didn't need rescuing. She needed fair terms and someone willing to keep them, and someone who would ask next time instead of simply deciding. Wyatt came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat down beside her and handed one over. Solomon lifted his head from the grass, studied them both for a moment with the calm certainty of an animal who had understood the whole thing since November, and went back to grazing. He knew, she said quietly. Wyatt looked out at the horse, then at her. Yes, he said, I think he did. She held her coffee and watched the last light settle over the land her father had left her, and thought that, for a man who never wasted a word in his life, he had gotten this one exactly right. Thank you for staying with Grace and Wyatt all the way to the end. If this one found its way into your day, come back for the next story, because on the frontier there's always another lamp burning somewhere, waiting to be understood.